Okay, let's dive deep. We're looking at a period that uh, fundamentally reshapes the United States.
hmm
1945 right through to 1990. That's, what, 45 years packed with transformation?
That's right. And we have this stack of source material here outlining some, well, seismic shifts across American society. You're talking demography, economics, culture, social structure,
A lot going on.
a whole lot. Our goal is really to cut through that complexity and pull out the essential insights, helping you grasp the significance of these decades.
Exactly. We want to explore how the country emerged from war and transformed into the nation we recognize, or maybe don't recognize today, understanding the roots of dynamics still in play. Let's unpack this. So right after World War II, the U.S. economy got this massive boost, and the sources point to one specific piece of legislation as a major catalyst: the GI Bill.
Ah, yes. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. Its initial purpose was pretty practical, address fears of mass unemployment, with 15 million GIs coming home. But its impact, as the notes highlight, was far, far bigger than just managing unemployment.
Now, how so? It wasn't just about keeping people off the streets, was it?
Not at all, no. This bill didn't just smooth the transition, it actively invested in the future workforce and economy. I mean, it sent millions of veterans to school. Interestingly, the majority went to technical and vocational training, not necessarily four-year colleges, at least initially.
Okay.
And the VA guaranteed something like $16 billion in loans. That money went mostly towards homes, farms, starting businesses. So this policy wasn't just supportive, it was a deliberate engine, that really fueled the economic prosperity taking hold in the late 40s and 50s.
And that booming economic environment coincided with something we all know about: the baby boom.
An absolutely unprecedented proportional population surge, just massive. The sources tell us that between 1946 and 1961, 63.5 million babies were born.
Wow.
Yeah. The U.S. population grew by over 28 million in the 1950s alone. And what's striking is where this growth happened. 97% of it was in urban and, crucially, suburban areas during that decade.
Okay, so you have this massive demographic wave
Yeah.
hitting just as the economy is roaring into what folks call the affluent society,
All right.
roughly 1950 to 1970.
And the scale of that affluence is, well, it's hard to overstate. National income nearly doubled in the 1950s, then almost doubled again in the 1960s. Just incredible.
Doubled, then doubled again.
Yeah. And by the mid-1950s, the notes point out a truly remarkable statistic. Americans, representing only about 6% of the world's population, held something like 40% of the world's wealth.
30%.
That kind of concentrated wealth was historically unique and really set the stage for everything that followed.
Wow, 40% of the world's wealth with 6% of the people. That level of prosperity must have changed daily life pretty dramatically.
Oh, absolutely. It fueled huge changes, like home ownership just skyrocketing from around 40% in the 1920s up to 60% by the mid-1950s.
Big jump.
And the workforce composition started shifting too. A majority of the new jobs for women post-war were in urban offices and shops. And that's a trend that would eventually see women make up half the workforce by the 1990s.
And here's where you start to see a fascinating tension, right? This sort of ideal of suburban domesticity emerging at the very same time more women are actually entering the paid workforce.
Absolutely. That disconnect, between the cultural ideal, the image, and the economic reality for many women, that was a significant factor fueling the feminist movement that really gained steam in the 1960s.
Right.
Now, going back to the economic growth itself, the sources identify some key drivers. A huge portion of the national budget, over 50% by 1960, was tied up in the defense industry.
50%.
Plus, you had cheap energy, more power supply, rising productivity thanks to education and new technology. All this combined meant the average American standard of living essentially doubled.
Doubled. Well, with that kind of disposable income, it's no wonder consumerism just exploded. Cars, TVs, refrigerators, vacations, the whole picture of the 1950s really comes into view.
Exactly. And that wealth fueled the dramatic expansion of the middle class. The sources say it more than doubled from about 5.7 million in 47 to over 12 million by the early 1960s.
Huge growth.
And a massive part of that new middle class life centered around the suburbs.
Right. The suburbs grew, what was it, 6 times faster than cities in the 1950s? Why such a rapid migration out?
Well, the notes list several interconnected reasons. Increased car production obviously made commuting feasible for more people.
Sure.
There was also white flight, many white residents moving out of urban centers, partly in response to the migration of African Americans to northern and Midwestern cities.
Okay.
And government policies played a really crucial role. Things like federal insurance for builders and homeowners made those suburban houses much more accessible and, frankly, appealing financially.
So government policy, technology like cars, demographic shifts, they all kind of converge to create this suburban landscape. And culturally, what was the prevailing ideal for family life in these new suburban homes?
Well, we saw the reemergence of what historians call the cult of domesticity. This was this widespread ideal pushed hard through magazines and TV that a woman's ultimate fulfillment came solely from being a homemaker and mother.
The perfect housewife image.
Exactly. It's a potent image from the era, even though the reality for many women was quite different. And Dr. Benjamin Spock's book, The Common Sense Book of Baby and Childcare, really fit perfectly into this mindset.
Oh yeah, his book was incredibly influential, wasn't it?
Phenomenally so. The notes say it sold 1 million copies a year between 1946 and 1960, 1 million a year.
Wow.
And his advice, emphasizing a nurturing environment, trusting parental instincts, it resonated really deeply in this era focused on home and family life.
So while families were settling into these new suburbs, what was happening to the labor movement? Was it still strong?
Yes and no. The notes show the labor movement actually reached its peak influence in terms of the percentage of the workforce unionized in the 1950s, but they also highlight a long-term trend starting then. The percentage of union workers has basically been declining ever since. It dropped from around 30% in the 50s to below 18% by 1990.
Interesting. Okay, so with all this economic energy reshaping the country, where were people actually living? The notes highlight a massive shift in America's geography, particularly the rise of the Sun Belt.
That's a huge story. This region, generally defined as the 15 states from Virginia down through Florida, across Texas to Arizona and California, including all the former Confederate states, it just saw explosive growth.
What drew people down there? Was it just the weather?
Well, the weather didn't hurt, especially with the advent of air conditioning. That made the South and Southwest much more comfortable year-round for living and working. Big factor.
Right. AC changed everything.
But also, the growth of war industries during WWII and then the rise of high-tech sectors drew millions to the West Coast. And major aerospace companies and military bases were huge magnets for states like Texas and Florida.
And this growth was really significant, wasn't it? Like, the population in the Sun Belt increased at twice the rate of the older industrial zones. California became the most populous state by 63.
Exactly. And this geographic shift had a flip side for the regions people were leaving. The Frost Belt, or what later became known, maybe less kindly, as the Rust Belt.
The old industrial heartland.
Precisely. The sources point out that traditional manufacturing workers in the Midwest started losing ground as many jobs moved overseas, seeking cheaper labor.
And that caused some friction, I bet.
Oh, yeah. This shift created resentment in states seeing job losses and population stagnation, especially when they compared it to the federal dollars flowing into the growing Sun Belt. The notes mention Rust Belt states feeling angered, citing a difference of something like $125 billion more in federal outlays going to southern and western states.
Wow. And this population and economic shift must have fundamentally altered the political landscape, too.
Absolutely. It really did. Every single president elected since 1964, according to the notes, has hailed from the Sun Belt.
Everyone, since 64.
Yep. And the region's congressional representation grew significantly, reflecting its increased population and therefore political power.
Okay, so alongside this huge internal migration, the period also saw a profound shift in who was coming to America from abroad, what the sources call the new immigration, particularly after 1965.
Right. The big catalyst there was the Immigration Act of 1965. It drastically changed the old national origins quotas. And this opened the door to a major influx of immigrants, primarily from Latin America, especially Mexico, and from Asia, including Southeast Asia, Korea, and the Philippines.
The sources also mention a growing population of undocumented immigrants around this time.
Yes, the estimate mentioned is around 8 million by 1985. And the Sun Belt states, maybe not surprisingly, were the most impacted by this new wave of immigration, especially places like California, Texas, and Florida. The majority of these new immigrants were Hispanic.
Do the notes give any specific numbers on that impact?
They do. By 1990, Hispanics made up about 25%, a quarter of the population in Texas, Arizona, and California. And over half of that Hispanic population in those states was of Mexican origin.
And how was this rapid demographic change perceived by, native-born Americans at the time.
Well, the sources indicate that this rapid shift did create resentment among some native-born Americans. This led to a political backlash against immigrants, which became particularly visible in California during the 1990s, just after our period ends. But the roots were there.
Okay, let's pivot slightly now and look at the economy and technology after 1970, because the picture started to change quite a bit from that immediate post-war boom.
It really did. The U.S. economy began a significant transition, moving away from being primarily manufacturing-based towards becoming a service economy.
Was that directly linked to what you mentioned earlier, the manufacturing jobs moving overseas?
That was a major factor, yes. As the notes explain, a large percentage of those traditional manufacturing jobs went to countries with cheaper labor costs. A big shift.
And the 1970s brought that really difficult economic phenomenon often called stagflation. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, stagflation. This was a real headache during the Ford and Carter administrations. Think about it. The economy wasn't growing much stagnant growth, but prices were still going up rapidly, inflation.
Right, the worst of both worlds.
Exactly. And the usual tools to fight inflation, like raising interest rates, tend to slow the economy even more. So it was a real bind. The notes point to factors like the energy crisis, the oil shocks, plus inflationary spending held over from the 1960s. It all contributed, making it a really painful period that defied easy economic fixes.
So even with those economic challenges, the service sector, things like retail, continued to expand.
Absolutely. That shift continued. And as we moved into the 1980s, the U.S. truly entered what we now call the information age.
And was the personal computer revolution a big part of that transition?
Oh, definitely. While computers existed before, obviously the 1980s saw personal computers become much more accessible, much more common. They fundamentally started changing how many people worked and even lived.
Right.
And the internet becoming widely available to the public slightly later, in the mid-90s, is really a direct continuation of this trend, even if it's just beyond our 1990 cutoff here.
And what about the overall economy in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan? What do the notes say about that?
Well, the notes highlight significant economic growth and lower inflation during this period, which was a welcome change after the 70s. However, they also point out that tax cuts combined with pretty significant increases in defense spending led to large government deficits and a tripling of the national debt by 1988. So growth, but also growing debt.
Okay, moving beyond the hard numbers of economics and demographics, these decades were also a time of just massive shifts in American culture. What were people watching, listening to? How were artists reacting to this changing world? The notes point to some really vibrant and sometimes turbulent transformations.
Oh, yeah. Culturally, it was incredibly dynamic. The biggest story early on was probably the rise of television. It emerged commercially in '47, and by the 1950s, TV had quickly displaced radio and become the dominant entertainment medium. Changed family life, politics, everything.
And for the younger generation in the 50s, you had movie stars like James Dean and Marilyn Monroe becoming huge icons.
Definitely symbols of a new kind of youth sensibility. And speaking of icons in youth culture, you absolutely have to talk about the explosion of rock and roll.
That music must have felt revolutionary at the time. Where did it come from, according to the sources?
Well, the notes trace its roots back to African American blues, which was often categorized as race music before it hit the mainstream. Then Elvis Presley burst onto the scene in 1956.
The king.
Right. And he was really pivotal in bringing rock and roll to a massive, largely white mainstream audience, changed popular music forever.
The art world was also doing some pretty radical stuff too, right?
Yeah, definitely pushing boundaries. In the 1950s, we saw the dominance of abstract expressionism.
Right.
You had artists trying to express their inner subjectivity, spontaneously, using techniques like Jackson Pollock's famous splattered paint canvases or Mark Rothko's huge fields of color. Willem de Kooning was another key figure.
Great action painting.
Exactly. Then, in the 1960s, partly as a reaction to that, you get pop art. Artists like Andy Warhol started famously drawing subjects directly from popular culture advertising, comic strips, even everyday objects like Campbell's soup cans or hamburgers.
So the exact opposite of abstract expressionism, in a way.
In many ways, yes. Very different aesthetic. Roy Lichtenstein with his comic panels, Claes Oldenburg with his giant sculptures of everyday things. They were major figures here too.
And consciously pushing against the mainstream, especially in the late 1950s, were the Beat generation, the Beatniks.
Right. This was a group, mostly young men, initially centered in New York's Greenwich Village, who felt really deeply alienated by post-war conformity and materialism. They were looking for something else.
Like Kerouac.
Jack Kerouac's novel On the Road became a sort of touchstone, a Bible, as the notes say, for restless youth. And Allen Ginsberg's poem Howl was another defining and controversial work from that scene.
What did their lifestyle actually look like? What were they rejecting?
Well, they emphasized experimentation with alcohol, with drugs, sex. They were really into jazz music, Eastern philosophies like Buddhism. They often embraced this kind of vagabond lifestyle, deliberately rejecting conventional middle-class norms and, the whole 9-to-5 aspiration.
And that sense of alienation, that searching, seemed to resonate with a much larger group as the baby boom generation started coming of age, leading into the New Left and the counterculture of the 60s.
Exactly. The sheer numbers of the baby boomers hitting college campuses in the 60s was huge. College enrollment went from about 1 million in 1950 to 4 million in 1960, just massive growth.
Wow.
And many of these students came from the very economic security created by the post-war boom. The notes say 75% came from families with above-average incomes. Now, it's important to note, student protest itself was a minority movement. Maybe 10–15% were actively involved, but it was highly visible and incredibly influential.
So tell us about the New Left. What were they pushing for?
Well, by the mid-1960s, the majority of Americans were actually under 30. And many young people, including those involved in the New Left, felt that universities and other big institutions were just these impersonal, indifferent bureaucracies. Groups like Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, co-founded by Tom Hayden, they advocated for what they called participatory democracy. They wanted individuals to have more direct control over the decisions affecting their own lives.
So less top-down control.
Right. And you saw things like the free speech movement at UC Berkeley in 1964. It started as a protest against restrictions on political organizing on campus, but it grew into this broader critique of the university bureaucracy itself. It involved sit-ins, confrontations with police, and groups like SDS became increasingly militant, especially as the Vietnam War escalated.
Okay, so that's the political side.
Yeah.
How did the counterculture differentiate itself from the New Left? They seemed related but distinct.
They definitely shared many of the New Left's critiques, the alienation from bureaucracy, from materialism, certainly opposition to the Vietnam War. But while the New Left generally focused on political action to change society, the counterculture largely turned away from traditional politics. They were more focused on creating an alternative way of life altogether. In some ways, you could see them as the cultural heirs of the Beats, but on a much larger scale.
These were the hippies then.
Yes, that's the common term. They experimented with communal living. They explored Eastern religions and mysticism and often used psychedelic drugs like LSD. Urban centers like San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district or rural communes became these sort of gathering places, these experiments in living differently.
And who are the voices of this movement?
Well, you had figures like Timothy Leary famously advocating LSD use with his turn on, tune in, drop out slogan. Theodore Roszak wrote influential books analyzing the counterculture. Charles Reich's book, The Greening of America, captured this idealism of finding personal liberation outside mainstream structures. They were famously called flower children, embracing peace and love.
But that kind of lifestyle,
Yeah.
was it sustainable for most people in the long run?
Well, the sources do point out that the communal aspects and, frankly, the heavy drug use often made it difficult to establish a stable, sustaining way of life for most participants. It was intense, but often fleeting.
And what kind of music defined this whole countercultural moment?
Folk music from artists like Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Pete Seeger was hugely important, often carrying strong protest themes. Even massive pop bands like the Beatles were clearly influenced by the American counterculture in their music and outlook.
And Woodstock.
Woodstock. August 1969, the notes highlight it as a kind of peak cultural event for the counterculture. You had legendary performances by Joan Baez, Jimi Hendrix, Santana. But the notes also mention the significant presence of unrestrained drug use and sex, which became part of its legend too. But by the early 1970s, the counterculture movement itself began to shrink, partly due to its own internal difficulties and excesses, and partly, as many participants eventually moved back towards more conventional lifestyles, maybe bringing some of those values with them, but re-entering the mainstream.
Let's shift now to some of the really deep societal changes and emerging conflicts that continued throughout this period, starting with what's often called the sexual revolution.
Right. This really got going in the early 1960s, and it was significantly spurred, the sources say, by two key technological developments: the introduction of the birth control pill.
The pill.
Exactly. And also the wider availability of antibiotics, which reduced the danger of STDs.
And how did those technologies impact society? What was the effect?
Well, the sources indicate they basically made possible and, you could argue, encouraged freer sexual practices. They really challenged long-held traditional taboos around things like premarital sex. It was a major shift in norms. And this period also saw the increasing visibility and activism of gay and lesbian rights movements, particularly gaining momentum in the 1960s and 70s.
Okay, now fast forward into the 1980s, and a new and truly devastating health crisis emerged.
Yeah.
The AIDS epidemic.
Yeah, a really tragic and terrifying development. Initially, as the notes point out, it received fairly limited public attention, partly because the earliest identified victims in the U.S. were primarily gay men and IV drug users, groups often marginalized. However, as the virus spread, it became clear it wasn't limited to any one group. By the end of the 1980s, the sources estimate at least 600,000 people were infected, including many heterosexual individuals. This eventually led to a much greater, though often still slow and sometimes contentious, national awareness and response.
The notes do mention that by the mid-1990s, just after our time frame, promising drug treatments were starting to emerge, offering at least a glimmer of hope against the disease.
Yes, that's an important later development, thankfully. Another really profound societal trend throughout this whole era was significant change in the structure and the perceived stability of the traditional family unit.
How did that actually manifest in the numbers? What did the sources show?
Well, the divorce rate, for instance, doubled in just the decade after 1965. It reached a point where by 1990, roughly 50% of marriages were ending in divorce. Half. And the proportion of adults living alone also tripled between 1950 and 1980. So big changes in household structure.
And what was the impact on children, according to the notes?
The notes show a significant increase in the percentage of children born to unmarried mothers. By 1990, it was about 1 in 6 for white children, 1 in 3 for Hispanic children, and fully 1 in 2 for African American children. There's also a note here about the sheer amount of time children were spending with television. The estimate is up to 15,000 hours by age 16, and the sources suggest this sometimes displaced parental interaction or influence.
So as society was experiencing all these really rapid changes, especially around family structures and cultural norms, we also saw a significant conservative reaction, what the sources describe as the fundamentalist resurgence or the rise of the religious right.
Yes, that's right. So-called born-again Christians became a much more visible and politically influential force, really starting in the late 1970s. This movement formed important alliances, maybe most notably with political figures like Ronald Reagan, and became a key player in what came to be known as the culture wars.
What were the key issues they championed or opposed? Just laying out what the source material says here.
Sure. The sources list their stances impartially. They strongly denounce things like abortion, pornography, homosexuality, the proposed Equal Rights Amendment for Women, or ERA, and affirmative action policies. And on the other hand, they championed things like prayer in public schools, the teaching of creationism alongside evolution, tougher penalties for criminals, and a strong national defense.
And figures like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson emerged as prominent leaders.
Yes, Jerry Falwell and his moral majority were very influential in the early 80s, aligning with Reagan. Pat Robertson became prominent in the mid-80s, heading the Christian Coalition. He even ran for president in 1988, though unsuccessfully. This religious right became a really influential, though still a minority bloc within the Republican Party, particularly concentrated in the traditionally conservative Bible Belt states of the Old South.
Now, it's probably important to remember, just briefly, that while we focus on some major trends, this period was also a time of burgeoning civil rights movements beyond the well-known African-American freedom struggle, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. That's a crucial context. The sources do note the rise of other significant movements during these decades. You have the women's rights movement really gaining strength and visibility in the 1960s and 70s. You also have Chicano rights activism, Native American rights activism really emerging strongly in the 60s and 70s. And as we mentioned, gay and lesbian rights activists becoming increasingly organized and visible, especially after the Stonewall riots in 1969 and through the 70s. It was a period of broad social ferment.
Wow. Okay. That truly was a deep dive into a period of just incredible transformation. I
Yeah.
mean, we started with that post-war economic engine,
Yeah.
fueled by the GI Bill, the baby boom, the rise of consumerism in the suburbs.
Yeah, this picture of affluence, but also conformity, maybe.
Right. Then we saw the map of America literally redraw itself with the Sun Belt's rise and new waves of immigration completely changing the demographics.
Huge shifts in where people lived and where they came from.
And we explored the cultural shifts from the sort of alienated cool of the beats to the psychedelic idealism and eventual disillusionment of the hippies,
Yeah, and rock and roll changing everything, TV taking over.
culminating in these really fundamental changes to family life, to sexuality, and the emergence of the religious right as a potent political force reacting to a lot of that change.
Absolutely. These decades weren't just a transition. They fundamentally rebuilt American society in many ways. They really set the stage for so many of the demographic, economic, and frankly cultural dynamics we're still navigating today. The seeds of contemporary debates were definitely sown in this era of immense growth and equally significant conflict.
So here is a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to maybe carry forward. How do the currents we trace today think about the ongoing demographic shifts driven by both internal migration to places like the Sun Belt and external immigration, the continuing evolution from a manufacturing to a service and now an information economy, and maybe the lingering echoes of those culture wars we talked about? How do those forces continue to shape the America you experience right now? What questions do these powerful historical forces raise for our future?
It really shows just how connected our present is to that incredibly dynamic, sometimes chaotic past, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Keep exploring those connections.